Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's lecture that will focus on the life, the legacy, and the contemporary relevance of the work of Martin Delany. And we have a special guest that will join us from Sierra Leone that will speak a bit about the influence of the diaspora, the work of Martin Delany, and how he has personally been involved in ways and means to connect Africa and the diaspora together in real, relevant, and material ways. We're at Delaware State University, and these are some of my great students in the African American experience to 1865. Elias, you could get the camera on some of the students there. The ones that are smiling are all averaging A's, and they're all smiling.
The minister dropped.
Oh, okay. So what we'll do is, since the minister is no longer there, we'll move on. But Martin Delany, as all my students know, given background to the work in his life, was an important figure in the 19th century who traversed the difficulties of his time. And as I always say, he's lived the life of like 7 or 8 different people in one body. So we'll talk about some of the experiences and the expertise of Martin Delany and go over some of the things, I'm sure, that happened here in Delaware with Martin Delany. And so our guest today, Syl or Sylvester Woolford, who is a native of Delaware. He currently resides in Newark, Delaware. He has 2 adult sons and 2 grandsons who live in Charlotte, North Carolina. He is a graduate of Delaware State University with a BS in Business Administration and Accounting. And I don't know, was that your recent grad or some time ago?
Before everyone was born here.
So he's one of us. He's also a graduate of Rutgers University, where he has an MBA in marketing. In 2008, he began researching his family history and expanded that research into total revisiting of African American history. He's been lecturing on the African American experience and history since 2010. He serves on several historical preservation boards. These boards include Delaware Heritage Commission, where he is the commissioner, Wilmington University on the historical committee, University of Delaware Library, the Delaware Digital Newspaper Project. He's a past member of the Friends of the Delaware Public Archives, and he's the founding member of the Delaware chapter of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. He's received many awards in recognition for his efforts to preserve and educate others on African American history. Newcastle County Executive Matt Myers declared June 30th in 2022 to be Syl Woolford Day. So those are some of his great accolades. I want to bring up my brother and friend to talk about Delany. Welcome to the Center for Global Africa.
It's good to be here.
Yes, bring it up for him real loud.
That last part is something for everyone to aspire to have a day, to get your own day.
I'm telling
you. You know you have achieved something. It's good to be here. I will give away my age and my year. I actually graduated from Delaware State in 1965, which is probably before your parents were born, but I'm still alive and well, and it's good to be here. Can I set my slides up?
Yes. Here you are.
There I go, and I can say, somehow I clicked something and got your slides, but that's okay.
You're always right here.
I am there. Can I start the show?
Mm-hmm. You can touch or click.
Or click. Well, let me,
Or use this one.
if we, can I press over here? That'll start my show if I get over
Oh,
here.
yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Again, if you, again, listen to the introduction, I am rewriting all of African American history, which means I have to live another couple hundred years. Again, what I've been using are African American newspapers. Traditional historians were back in the microfilm era, where you had to sit there, if you're familiar with the old technology of looking at microfilm, but now we are all digitized. So there are many newspapers, again, which are now digitized, and it gives you fantastic access to them. And we're going to be looking at some of those newspapers today. So that's the basis of my research and the basis of rewriting history. You say, how can you rewrite history? Well, if you're doing history, you go to the library and you get a book. I said, no, we need to hear the voices of our people, and we need to hear what was important to African Americans. So we need to look at these black newspapers and find out what was important to them. Again, so that's what I have done. And again, we're not talking about what Martin Delany did. We're talking about channeling Martin Delany. We're going to have we're going to have Martin Delany speak, and then you can say, well, what did he really mean, or what is the interpretation, or how is that relevant today? So that's what we're going to try to do, and that's what I try to do in presenting history. Delany was born March 6, 1812, died January 24th, 1885. And as has already been said, he didn't live one life, he lived many lives. He, again, was a doctor, he was a military person, he was, again, all of these things. And again, in the next 20 minutes, half hour, whatever, I can't cover all of them, but we are going to try to address some of them. He was born in Charlestown, Virginia, 1812. Moved to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in 1822. Moved to Pittsburgh in 1831. He started his own newspaper. So this is his first career. 1843, he had a newspaper called The Mystery. Frederick Douglass recruited him. Frederick Douglass, again, said, hey, this guy's doing incredible work in Pittsburgh, and I want to partner with him. It was a partnership. They were co-editors. Although, again, as history has changed, been written, Frederick Douglass kind of gets all of the credit for the North Star. But Delany, again, especially in the beginning, deserves, again, at least half the credit. After, again, becoming a newspaper person, he decided he wanted to go to medical school. He had been training as a doctor or in medicine with some of his friends in Pittsburgh. So he was very much interested in medicine. So again, he again enrolled at Harvard. He again became, very concerned about whether African Americans were really going to become first-class citizens in the United States. And that was something which had plagued free blacks from the time the first black got their freedom. They, again, were up against this challenge of should they go back to Africa, should they stay here, were they ever going to get first-class citizenship? And the debate went on, and it was a contentious debate. Delany finally called a meeting and said, if you want to stay in America, don't come to my convention. Okay? And so he only wanted folks going back to Africa. And again, he said, if you want to go to Haiti, you want to go to Asia, you want to go to Canada, you can stay home too. I'm talking about immigrating to Africa, and we only want to talk to those people. So, and again, most of these conventions during this era were headed by Frederick Douglass. He told Frederick Douglass to stay home. And again, this is powerful things that are going on in Delany's life and in Delany's world. He moved to Canada. He didn't think, again, his family was getting the right education or being respected here, so he moved to Canada, still with this plan to create this movement, the Delany movement, to go back to Africa. He sailed from New York to Liberia in 1859. Again, he came back, and again, the Delany movement, or moving to Africa, was sidelined because of the Civil War, because of his experience in the medical field. He was made a major in the U.S. colored troops, and again served in the U.S. colored troops. When he got out of the Army, or when the Civil War ended, he started another career. He wanted to be a politician, or became a politician. He actually ran for lieutenant governor down in South Carolina. So you can see that, again, as we keep repeating this, he had many lives, and again, was a politician, was a doctor, was a newspaper man, was started a movement, and again, hasn't gotten the recognition that he deserves. And much of this recognition is just the challenge of the times, the challenge that all of us face in trying to determine the direction of our lives and the direction, again, of the race in general. And Delany was always in that debate. The North Star was started in 1847. Co-editors, Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. Delany was in Pittsburgh. And Delany was actually the reporter. It was Douglass who was, I guess, printing the newspaper and organizing things and selling papers and those things. Delany was his reporter. And one of the first articles that Delany produced, was, again, from Pittsburgh. And it was just an overview of what was going on in the world, or what Delany could see from Pittsburgh. And the article starts off by saying, "Dear Douglass, dear Frederick Douglass, this probably is my last letter hailing from this quarter, and I should have been gone ere this, but providential matters beyond my control have prevented it. Anti-slavery as such is still a low tide in this quarter. The almighty dollar, the overruling Perth, being first in thought, first in desire, and first thing grasped as by our fellow countrymen. The temperance cause is beginning to look up." So this is Delany looking from where he sits, and he says, well, this anti-slavery movement isn't getting the momentum that I need, because we're talking money. Folks are making too much money off the backs of slaves, and they don't want to talk about giving up their slaves. Many movements were consolidated together under social change. It was the anti-slavery movement, the women's suffrage movement, or universal suffrage, and the temperance movement were all together. And he's saying, okay, well, the temperance movement is taking up steam, so guys are not going to be drinking at bars soon. And we did get the prohibition through this particular effort. Delany, again, had access to things around the world. He makes the comment that says, the Mexicans, it would appear, are yet conquered, as so far as from being the case that they, if Army reports are at all reliable authority. So we're back again to 1848. The Mexican-American War is still in progress. And Delany is saying that there are 90,000 Mexicans on the border, and they're not ready to give up. After the Mexican-American War, the United States took over Texas and took over most of the western United States. So Delany had access to this information, which is, again, critical to a newspaper or newspaper reporting. He also had information from Haiti. In this article, he says, Haiti, according to foreign reports, is now quite a prosperous condition. The president is very popular with the people, and all departments of the government are harmonious. So his report from Haiti was positive. Haiti again had many challenges during this day, but Delany is saying, you know, based upon what I'm hearing, again, things in Haiti are going very well at this time. Douglas was involved with the abolitionist movement, and some of his sources, mainly his funding sources, wanted to know whether 4 million slaves could transition from slavery to freedom, whether they could make this transition and still survive. So they told Delany to go to Wilmington, Delaware. He came down here to Delaware because Delaware was a slave state, but the majority of its blacks during this period of time were free. And it was Delany's job to visit the schools, to visit the churches, to talk to the people, and see how they had transitioned from slavery to freedom, and see how successful they had become. So this is Delany writing again back to Dear Douglas. He's starting again off with Dear Douglas. Since my last, I have held meetings in Wilmington, Delaware, from which place I wrote, Westchester, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia, at which place I was assisted by our worthy friend and co-laborer, William W. Brown, the noble fugitive. There are some 2,000 of colored population in Wilmington, all of whom appear to be quite an industrious and laboring people, but seem not to have the instilled with the higher incentives of life. Education, as heretofore, has been greatly neglected and probably put little care for the colored people, hence the characteristics of the slave. So this is Delany coming in and making an observation. He's just looking around town and he's saying, okay, these folks are free, but some of them are acting like or looking like they're still in this condition of slavery. And again, based upon his opinion, they don't seem motivated, or they don't seem to focus on the better things in life or moving themselves up. So Delany again is making this observation, and it's a critical observation because we had to go through this freeing 4 million slaves, and we went through the Freedmen's Bureau, and it was an incredible, tumultuous period. But here's Delany trying to, again, navigate his way through and figure out, again, how this can be successful. And so he's saying that he's a stranger passing through this place might well mistake 4/5 of the colored persons whom he would see in the streets to be slaves. So again, he's not complimentary of those black folks he runs into. There are 3 schools. Colored children are here. Minor and primarily branches are taught. The best interesting of the schools is taught by Mr. Daniel Anderson. And again, he talks about really they're not using the right textbooks. They're not, again, teaching higher level mathematics. And again, this is an incredible observation for his period. And the period we're talking about is Harriet Tubman was still a slave. This is 1848. Harriet Tubman was still a slave. Slavery still existed. Slavery wouldn't end until the end of the Civil War. But Delany is the analyzer of whether setting blacks free and having them live in this country can be successful. He talked about there being 4 churches here: the American Methodist Episcopal, the Zion African Methodist Episcopal, the Union African Methodist Church, and the Zion Methodist Church, and comes to the conclusion there are too many churches. They'd rather have more schools than churches. This is an observation. Obviously, Delany was not that much into religion. Again, most folks would say we need all the churches we have, but Delany's making the observations, you know, I don't think these churches are going to get out of where we are. Delany stayed with Frederick Douglass and the North Star for a few years, and then he decided to go to medical school. He enrolled in Harvard, and he enrolled in Harvard with 3 other blacks, and it was not a positive outcome. This, again, article talks about Martin Delany, Daniel Lane Jr., Isaac H. Snowden enrolled in Harvard in 1850, but were asked to leave by a vote of the students at the end of the semester. The students said they could not consent to identify as fellow students with blacks whose company he would not keep in the streets and whose society as associates would not be tolerated in our homes. This is racism. Okay, this is the students at Harvard saying, I don't want to sit next to these folks in class. I don't want to tell folks that I had black folks in my medical school, and I wouldn't even invite these folks into my house. They didn't even know Delany. But this is the racism that they had to deal with, and so Delany again had to leave Harvard again, although he still had some medical skills which he used later on. He called a convention again through all the things that he was going through in the observation. He said, well, you know, we probably should go back to Africa. And in this article it talks about we're not going back to Africa because it's better. We're going back to Africa because it's probably not worse. We are being oppressed so much here, okay, that Africa cannot be worse. And if we go back to Africa, we will be sovereign. We will be able to be our own rulers. And again, we're talking 1854. Liberia had just been freed, and I don't know whether freed is the right word. The United States said, we're no longer going to support you, was what they said. And Liberia had to go to England, actually, to get financing. But Delany called a convention, and it was very specific what he was looking for. Men and brethren, and the terms they were using of the day, the term they were using was brethren. We again try to find out, how do we identify black folks or African folks or folks from Africa. They chose the term brethren to identify this group of folks, to unite us under one umbrella. So it says, the time has now fully come when we as an oppressed people should do something effectively and use those means adequate to the attainment of the great and long denied, to do something to meet the actual demands of the present and perspective necessary of the rising generation of our people in this country. To do this, we must occupy a position of entire equality, of unrestricted rights, composed in fact and acknowledge necessary parts of the ruling element of the society in which we live. And again, this is the direction you're moving in. It says we can not be second-class citizens and still survive in this society. We must get to a place where we are part of the ruling class, where we are the voting class, where we are participating in the government. The question is not whether our condition can be bettered by immigration, but whether it can be made worse. If not, then there is no part of the widespread universe where our social and political conditions are not better here than in our native country. Nowhere in the world as here prescribed on account of color. He's saying that race is impacting us in the United States and will forever impact us in the United States, that getting back to the motherland or homeland is the alternative that I see best for us. Delany obviously had critics. It's not, again, agreed among other folks that you walk in the room and say, hey, we're all going back to Africa. And again, there was an American Colonization Society headed by Henry Clay, where Henry Clay said, well, we're going to have slaves, and then we're going to have free blacks on their way back to Africa. There will be no free blacks in the society because we're never going to let them buy land, vote, get first-class citizenship. So there were other forces saying, go back to Africa. And Frederick Douglass was fighting these forces to say, we're not going back. But Delany, again, had positive outcomes that he was looking for in getting back to Africa. And so he had to separate himself from the American Colonization Society and say, well, they want us to go back to Africa for one reason, but we're going back to Africa because we are going to rule in Africa when we get back. So this is a letter from another newspaper person that again challenges Delany's idea of going back to Africa, and not only going back to Africa, but leaving slavery in America. That the free blacks were going to go back to Africa and leave 4 million slaves in bondage. Douglass again said that it is our obligation to our brothers in bondage to make sure that they get out of bondage before we go anyplace. And that's the decisions that were being made, or the challenges that were being made. In 1859, Delany arrived in Africa, and it was Palm Sunday. I mean, they welcomed him back, that this is the great American who is coming back again, and he's bringing the other sons and daughters of Africa back with him. And so again, this is again a welcoming force. The arrival of Martin Robinson Delany in Liberia is an era in the history of African immigration, an event doubtless that will long be remembered by hundreds and thousands of Africa's exiled children. The news of the advent of these shores of the far-famed champion for the elevation of colored men in the United States and the great antagonist of the American Colonization Society spread throughout the country. So Delany was coming back and bringing with him the lost, sons and daughters of Africa to rise up Africa. And it wasn't a colonization type thing. It wasn't just get out of here and don't come back. They were coming back as rulers, and they were coming back to participate in the societies. Delany was saying, and he gave many speeches when he got back to Africa, I will therefore say to you that your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. Yea, more, sir, your country shall be my country. To this point, the doctor said he had come, and to the point every free colored man in the United States must come before he would consent to leave the land. He's saying to free blacks in America, I'm going to Liberia, and their God is my God, and their country is my God, and you should recognize that you are being oppressed, and the only way to get out of this oppression is to join me and go back to Africa. Let me thank you for your time. Again, there's so much here with Delany and so much to be learned. You are learning it now. I encourage you to learn more, but his enthusiasm and his passion and his vision are something that should be learned by everyone. Thank you for your time.
You can give it a little louder for him. Appreciate it. It's not every day you hear about Martin Delany, and I think it's a travesty of justice and on history that he's been left on the margins of American history in that way. And you would think that him being amongst the first blacks to go to Harvard, that would make him a part of mainstream history. You would think that being appointed as a major by Lincoln would get him in the pages of history and he would be honored. You would think that the fact that he was a judge would have got him in history. But his identity that he embraced, that saw Africa as an expansion of the black experience, is what became the taboo for him. I would argue that has ostracized him. But today, we are reliving Delany on several levels, and we have the distinguished Martin Delany Fellowship here at Delaware State University that the Center for Global Africa offers. And we have two distinguished diplomats who now hold that seat. And we're going to hear from one of them now. I think he's online.
Not yet.
He's not back?
No,
Okay.
Not yet. I just sent him a message, so hopefully he'll come back.
Okay, technical difficulties.
Okay.
What I'll do is, I have some slides that I want to share on Delany. And I appreciate the overview that you gave, and I know they have questions. I have at least one or two questions I want to follow up with about Delany. But I think Delany deserves a lot of critique today, especially when you consider that the United States is now attempting to reestablish relations in Africa in a way that it hasn't done before. If you look at Africa from a geopolitical standpoint, the Russians, the Chinese are all taking deep stakes in Africa in terms of development. As Africans in America, Africa should always be viewed more than an outside of geopolitics. For the African in America, Africa is history, Africa is homeland, Africa is heritage. And there's a rich history and a rich connection that ties Africa to the diaspora, as I explained to you all who are my students, this concept of and definition of what the diaspora is. It's critically important. And so Martin Delany, as his first slide indicates, I say in the subtitle that he was an exponent of Africa-Diaspora accords and relations. Because when he went to Africa, he didn't just go there as a tourist. He went there and he actually signed a treaty so that Africans could formally return to Africa in an official way, in this way that would ultimately lead to sovereignty. I think the minister's on.
The slide is not yours. It's Mr. Woolford's slide that's still
Oh.
showing.
I don't know why. I think it may have something to do with your clicker. But I'm going to take both of yours out.
Okay, and if you hit the escape key, you might get me out of there too.
Pressing the escape button at the top.
Did it do it?
No.
I hit escape.
See if you press this one and it'll...
Okay, because you got to do it.
There it is.
Okay, so we good? Okay. So this is Martin Delany, who I say in the subtitle, the exponent of Africa-Diaspora accords and relations, because the accord referring to the fact that he acted as his own diplomat representing Africans here, because he saw with his own eyes this evolution of European freedom and how it was expressed. And Delany saw himself as no less of a freedom fighter, no less of a leader than anyone else he had ever met or encountered. And he tried to impress upon African people that they should aspire to that same way of image and view of self and identity. Hence the critical parts that he made when he came to Wilmington, and the way he felt Africans should uphold themselves and, you know, take a stance about who they are and have pride in themselves. So that's the accord. The relations of diaspora, you know, is that he felt that it was critically important to link Africa to the diaspora as an expansion of the black experience. People look at it and say, well, Delany's a separatist, Delany doesn't like white people. You could read in his writings where he said, I'm paraphrasing, that, you know, he would love to be here in America. He would love to establish equality here, but is it realistic? So the reinterpreting of the Delany doctrine, as I call it, meaning the things that he espoused ideologically, that he wrote about extensively, that became part of the way he engaged others in terms of what you could describe as his global vision, that doctrine, and the revitalizing of the Delany blueprint, because he was more than just talking about freedom. He took steps to create this blueprint that others could follow. And I would argue it's just as relevant today as it was back then, particularly as the U.S. is now attempting to reestablish new relationships in Africa. So I say these things about Delany are modern accelerators of Pan-Africanism and Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063 is Africa's official blueprint itself for full development, the transformation of Africa, that includes the diaspora being vital parts of that development. And I told you in my class that the African Union sees Africans in the diaspora as the sixth region. Africa has 5 geographical regions: North, East, South, West, and Central. The sixth region refers to Africans who live outside of Africa's borders, who are Africans by ancestry, who believe in Africa as being this new place of pioneering development that Africans here should understand. You don't have to go to Africa, but you should be concerned about Africa, and you should have some type of involvement in Africa, because as Delany saw it, equality would have been very limited for him unless that expansion into Africa took place. So Delany, I would argue, by any objective measure, he was a giant of his time. By any objective measure. And as Syl talked about, he and Douglas had these public disputes because Delany felt as though America was important, but if there were ever going to be equality, it had to be based on the achievements of black people, not based on something that other people wrote on paper. He was a physician, a major, an author, a judge, a newspaper publisher, a public intellect, explorer, emigrationist with an E, meaning the focus was on leaving and establishing bases of power elsewhere. He was a sovereignist. He sought self-government as a form of creating these new opportunities for Africans in America, directly tied to Africa. And he was self-described African envoy to travel to these places and open up relationships. So I'm focused on 2 of his works. On the table there, you'll see I have, I think, like 10 books of Delany or on Delany. This particular document, the Proceedings of the National Immigration Convention of Colored People, that was produced in 1854, and I argue is one of the most significant documents absolutely of that time period. Arguably, and I would stand with it, one of the most important documents that African people have ever produced in this country. And when you consider that it was 1854, it's extra extraordinary, because the thinking, the language, the ideals that were ascribed in this document, if a European had wrote this, it would be like a Magna Carta for a group of people. So in that convention, which you talked about, that was in Cleveland, 106 delegates, 29 were women. And the conference was about the elevation of women as well. And I'll read what he wrote in part of the resolutions about women, that the potency and respectability of a nation or people depends entirely upon the position of their women. Therefore, it is essential to our elevation that the female portion of our children be instructed in all the arts and sciences pertaining to the highest civilization. That's them in 1854. And during that time, if you looked at where women were in European societies, this kind of a statement like that would have been taboo in full. But Delany was advocating then where America is really at now, or trying to get to. So that was the brilliance of Delany. He profoundly applied the concepts of sovereignty in this document. The sections include a platform on declarations of the sentiments, a constitution, resolutions, as well as portions of the book that he wrote, The Political Destiny of the Colored Race, which is also on the table there. So, as I said, among the most significant documents ever produced. The second document that he produced is when he returned from Africa, right? Having traveled there on his own volition with, as you said, he had stakeholders and people who he had to go around to talk to invest in him and invest in this idea. And without technology, without any cell phone, emails, he put this structure together to travel to Africa and return back with this treaty that he signed to create these sovereign settlements in a way that I would argue, had Delany would have been successful, and say had the U.S. government back then would have been of the mindset that it is now, that Africa is important and that African people in America are Africans and therefore its history, its heritage, its homeland. Let's see what the government could do, because this does good for everybody. This benefits everybody. This is not just a black thing. It benefits everybody. Met with resistance. And this is what got him ostracized out of history. This is why the Center for Global Africa is revitalizing him, bringing him back to life. So this report that he wrote, the official report of the Niger Valley Exploring Party, once again, one of the most important historical documents, I would argue, that Black America has produced, all the way up to 2023. But if you ask people about this report, very much unfamiliar. So this assessed Africa, African Americans from sovereign perspectives, and what I argue foremost is that it's a progenitor or an early report of what African governments are producing now to examine the socio-economic performance of nations as well as the effectiveness of presidents. And this is done through reports of the African peer review mechanism of the African Union. And the beauty of this, as I stand here today with the Center for Global Africa, is that we have the foresight and the vision to say, hey, African Union, we want to work with you as historically black colleges and universities. We want to link our students to your students. We want to link our investors to your investment projects. And so the Center for Global Africa has a partnership with the African Union, with the African peer review mechanism, to open up opportunities to become part of this continuity of the work that Martin Delany started. The third bullet point there, de facto diplomat, meaning that, you know, he didn't wait to be appointed. He didn't seek permission. He knew what had to be done, and he galvanized all the forces and the resources to make himself effective and relevant in that way. So this report, very important.
The props are not changing.
Oh, no? Is it? You didn't see that one at all?
No.
Let me hit escape again. Something's always messing. My students will tell you I'm always having trouble with technology, right? I was telling the tech person, I'm surprised that it came on as quickly as it did, and now this is not acting right. Let me try it this way. No?
No. It's stuck on the first slide.
Isn't that something? Anyway, trust me, what I'm telling you is on those slides. They're absolutely there. And I'm closing. Let me see how much time I have. Is the minister on?
Not yet. I've sent him a message. Tell him to come
Okay.
on. Okay.
Good. My final slide, it talks about Delany being this exponent of new ideas, that he was a visionary who didn't just talk about or contemplate doing things. He actually did these things at a time when he himself could have easily been lynched for being uppity, for being too big for his britches, for being a guy who thought he could outthink white people, for being a person who actually traveled to Africa. And I told you, when he came back, He would wear African clothes, and he would say definitively, I know more about Africa than you do. I know more about African people than you do. And he took on those roles to be extraordinary in those ways. So the Delany doctrine is important. The Delany blueprint is important. And I've always said that if you as students really understood the work, the life, the legacy of Martin Delany and the real impact of what he did during that time period, the extraordinary dimensions and uniqueness of what he did, it would fundamentally change the way you view the black experience, in the way you see Africa, in the way Africa and the diaspora would interrelate. So with that, I'm going to pause, because I'm hoping that our diplomat in residence will be able to join us from Sierra Leone. But I'm going to defer back to you, Sil, and have our students ask some questions. But I have a question that I wanted to ask, and that's about, you mentioned that when he came to Delaware, he did so because he was on this mission to examine what freedom would look like and where Africans were psychologically at that time period. I would use the term psychological because, you know, that's what I share with my students. We go over a whole thing about the psychology of slavery, what people were thinking. You know, how did they internalize what their surroundings were. So could you talk a bit more about that psychology that he encountered, and who were the stakeholders that he got this money from to do all of this?
The Anti-Slavery Society, and this becomes incredibly complex because in doing history, I always am concerned about the Quakers, if I may throw that out on the table. The Quakers wanted slavery to end, wanted blacks to be free, didn't want blacks to be Quakers, right. Okay, and didn't want blacks to be in the United States. So they were part of this movement also to send free blacks back to Africa. And many of the prominent Quakers of the day, okay, went to Africa and helped set up the government. There is assistance being given by Quakers and Quakers money. This was the Quakers who funded Delany to come to Wilmington and wanted this report back. They wanted to know, because they were in debate with themselves as to whether blacks should stay here or go back to Africa. And so they needed this report. They needed this Wilmington report to say, okay, are blacks making this transition? Are they setting up schools? Are they setting up churches? Are they setting up businesses? Are they building brick houses? Are they organized? Are they establishing communities? Mm-hmm. And so these were things that the Quakers were interested in. And again, as you can see from Delany came to the point of saying, you know, we're not going to get first-class citizenship here. We're not going to be able to participate in the government. And so that was a part of why Delany came to Wilmington, and part of the decision-making process of mainly Quakers who were funding this abolitionist movement and anti-slavery movement that was going on. So that again is why he was here. And again, he had some. And this is an article which is available, and we can pass it around. You can get it online. That again, he was looking at churches, he was looking at schools, he was looking at organization, and he had some folks that he identified in the community that were leaders of the community. And every community needs its leaders. And so again, he had established those. And so it was critical in assessing, you know, how blacks were going to make this transition.
Explain Quakers. We didn't go with it.
Okay. Quakers were a religion. Okay. Again, they were the first ones to declare that, to make it simple, slavery was a sin, and demanded that their members free their slaves. This also gets into the anti-slavery movement. The anti-slavery movement was split in terms of, should we ask the churches to declare slavery a sin and declare their members not to participate in slavery, or should the government, okay, make changes? Should we get a 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment, or can't we go to the Presbyterians, can't we go to the Methodists, can't we go to the Baptists, and have the religious denominations talk about how egregious it was to hold folks in bondage, okay? And so there were these different approaches to ending slavery, and the Quakers were the models for doing that. But again, the Quakers literally didn't want black folks in their neighborhood, if I may say that. And very few, there's some notables, but very few black folks became Quakers, okay? And so it wasn't a case of them embracing black folks as equals. They were saying, okay, slavery's bad, now get out of here. And in Wilmington specifically, many of the Quakers were helping with the schools. They were helping to set up schools and churches and those kinds of things. So they were very helpful, but they were not helpful to the point of first-class citizenship.
Thank you. Okay, students, over to you.
So, for instance, you were saying how like the Quakers didn't necessarily like Africans, but didn't want them to be like part of America. But do you think that's like more of a psychological thing that was ingrained into this newer generation of white people, that like black people just, you know, aren't worth being in America, but it's still bad that we treat them this way? Like, you know what I mean? How it's kind of like, it doesn't make sense. It sounds like an oxymoron.
I'm going to ask this is my expert on that. Why don't you, this is Mr. Anthony Johnson, who's an expert on Methodism and religion and those kinds of things. So Mr. Johnson, go right ahead.
An excellent question that you asked, and it's critically, it really does describe very well the complexity of white folks' mentality in that time frame, because the Quakers were enslavers themselves, but they were the first to want to free black folks. But at the same time, they understood, right here in Kent County, Delaware, Warner Mifflin, he was the first Quaker who realized what we today call reparations. So he understood some black folks were ready to be free, some were not. And at the same time, they opened their door, but they didn't welcome people in. So it's complex. I don't think that answers your question, but I just want...
I didn't really think that there would be an actual concrete answer. I just kind of wanted to know.
Well, you're a student, but you should read, because that's a wonderful question that you're asking. It just really gets to the heart of the complexity of the issue. Wonderful question. Keep searching.
Again, there were several religions which were enslavers. The Episcopalians were the Church of England, okay, and the Anglicans, as again Mr. Anthony always tells me, and again it goes back to who were the enslavers, and then who were the folks that were evangelical in terms of their religion. The Methodists and the Baptists, again, were going on to the slave plantations and converting slaves to Methodism and the Baptist religion. And some of our great early Methodist preachers were coming out of the camp meetings that were going on to bring folks to Jesus or bring them to religion. Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, and here in Delaware, Peter Spencer, the founder of the African Union Church, were all preachers in slavery as they were slaves, and came out, first joined white churches, then when again they didn't have the reading skills or singing skills or temperament to function in the white church, formed their own denominations. And again, this is the process that took place of this transition from slavery to freedom, to again establishing self-segregation, if I may use that term. They chose to especially worship, and even today we talk about the most segregated hour of the week is 11 to 12 during church service, and some of these again challenges and traditions have continued in our society. Other questions?
I have two. I'll start with what do we know about Dr. Martin Delany's upbringing, such as how he, where he studied prior to his accomplishments, and the many lives that he lived to establish himself as a respectable writer, future surgeon, military leader, politician, and so forth.
Again, in my as I did my introduction, he ended up in Pittsburgh, which is where his career started early in his life, and that's where again he started the newspaper. I don't have any information on who his parents were or siblings or those kinds of things. Haven't done that kind of research, but obviously he was a brilliant person to be able to make these incredible transitions from editor of a newspaper to medical doctor to politician to judge to all of these things are again most folks would have stumbled or walked away from, but he was always ready to meet the task.
Yeah, and my studies pick up later in his life, but I do know that he was born to an enslaved father and a free mother, which of course, as you know, the status of the mother determines the status of the child. So he was born free, and that gave him a lot of leverage to be able to move through society in ways that he would not have had he been enslaved. And it kind of depicts again the complexities of the times, that he was black but yet he wasn't enslaved, but his father was, and he excelled and was those are some of the things that motivated him.
The second question I have is it true that Dr. Delany is a descendant of royalty, and if so, what comparisons can we make about Delany's experience, ideologies, and goals for blacks and Africans versus someone of action who's also of royal descent, such as Prince Abdul-Rahman?
He claimed royalty. He claimed royalty, and he had actually identified his African relatives connected to royalty, which he embraced and he claimed. The part of Prince Abdul-Rahman, I would say in many ways he reflected that, but differently, because he wasn't born in Africa. He was American born, but he saw himself certainly as being entitled to the rights and privileges of being in America, which is why he committed to fighting in the Civil War and never abandoning that cause in terms of what he felt his obligations were being American, but that didn't stop him from understanding heritage and ancestry and wanting to live that dimension of his life, of his identity, which is why I often say this identity of Africans in America needs to be re-examined in a 21st century way, because it's like viewed as though you are walking, talking contradiction of yourself, because you're African by blood and you're American by circumstances of history and politics. But Delany, and as well as Prince Abdul-Rahman, they personified it in a way to show that these were not competing ideals inside their minds, even though it may have been in society, but they saw them as a means by which it was an asset to them. So I would argue today, being African is an asset that other people don't have if they're not African. But it becomes a bit of a paradox because African is not really valued in society, you know. But it is when you understand how globally it has its advantages. Next question.
Let me ask you a question, if I could. Africa has been challenged with Ebola, with AIDS, with the pandemic. Delaware Senator Chris Coons, I believe, once was heading the Senate African Committee. Are you in touch with him? Is he into economic development of Africa?
Well, it's a growing process. He's very much aware of the work that we're doing. Let's see how the support factors happen, you know, to pair what we do and the importance of what we do with the actual priorities of Africa. Student with a question.
My question is for you more so, like how growing up in Delaware and then going to William Penn and then coming here for accounting, how did you get into like African history? What made you choose Martin Delany to focus all your life?
I'm an accountant and had spent most of my life in accounting or computer services or those types of things. In 2008, I came back home. I spent some time in Passaic, New Jersey, and Clifton, New Jersey.
Just found out we're living in the same place.
Then
home.
Hey, then in Anaheim, California, and then came back to Delaware. And the city of Newark did a history of Newark, 250 years of the history of Newark, 1758 to 2008. And they left my family out of the book, okay? And my family's been in Newark for 213 years. And in life, we look for motivations. We again try to look for positive motivations, but sometimes you look for negative motivations. And so I got left out of the book and I felt insulted. And being black, frequently we get insulted because white folks only write white history. So we get left out of the book anyway. But I took that as motivation to trace my family back 213 years, and again found some interesting things. Again, a piece of history. The most important black person in Delaware for many years was Peter Spencer, the head of Peter Spencer Churches. But when Peter Spencer died, my great-great-grandfather, Ellis Saunders, took over the African Union Church. So he was in charge of the African Union Church for a while, and to his demise and the church's demise, he caused a split in the African Union Church for the AUMP and UAME denominations. And again, this is me putting myself in the history book. And then I said, well, if my family was left out of this history book, what other things are left out and what don't I know? And I could begin to ask myself basic questions like, did black folks fight in the Civil War? And, you know, it seems like a simple question, and I didn't have an answer. Okay? And the answer to the question is that Lincoln was trying to save the Union. And he was willing to put slavery in the Constitution as the original 13th Amendment, inviting the Confederate States back in the Union and saying you can have slavery in perpetuity forever, just coming back in the Union. We'll have slave states and free states. Okay, they rejected him and wanted their own country. But again, it was a case of me asking myself, and again, it gets back to the issue of, and this is something my niece taught me, someone always teaches you something, which is education is continuum. Okay, we must continue to be in the process of being educated. And so I had to challenge myself and said, forget about the numbers, forget about debits and credits and all that kind of stuff. There's something you don't know about the society and the way we're living and the challenges we face, and you have to be a good citizen and be able not only to just vote every other year, but to participate in making this society better. And much of that is associated with knowing your history. And again, it starts off with basically, yes, 10% of the Union Army at the end of the Civil War were African Americans. And so basically and I'm retired now, spend 6-7 hours a day going through history and rewriting the history books. It sounds strange that I'm rewriting the history book, but there's some things that we should know. We talk about the Vietnam War, and I have a presentation or a research project that says the Vietnam War and the Black Power protest movement. Now, if we go through history, we find out that black folks were opposed to the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King against the Vietnam War. Malcolm X against the Vietnam War. Chickens are coming home to roost. Stokely Carmichael said, any black man who died for this country is a fool. The Black Panthers said, you know, we shouldn't be fighting in any wars for America. And you go through, and again, you're developing your consciousness to say, should we be fighting the Vietnam War? And then you say, we have these segments of the black society who, for different reasons, you know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, were against the war. And so we challenge ourselves to look at their psyche and say, what were they seeing, and do I see the same thing? And again, we're looking at the same thing with Martin Delany. We're trying to get into Martin Delany's head and say, you know, and Martin Delany said, let's go back to Africa. And so we challenge ourselves to say, should we go back to Africa? Is now the right time? What would happen if I went back to Africa? And so we should, again, as lifelong learners, be able, again, to take these subjects and know how we fit into this world and this society. Other questions?
And we reached our time limit too, because I know they have other classes. Right. Anyone else? Last minute question, comment, observation, as I always say? Well, we want to thank you so much for coming. Appreciate you so much. Give it real loud for our guests.